Alrighty, welcome back to JavaScript Essentials. In this lesson, we're going to learn about arrays. We sort of have learned about them already, but I want to get you a little more familiar with loops, because loops, if you don't come from a programming background, a loop is basically a set of code, or a few lines of code, that keeps running until it doesn't. I know how vague that sounds, but it'll make sense once you start learning about loops. But before we do that, let's start off with a joke. Why did the programmer quit his job? Because he wanted a raise. Anyway. Sorry, I couldn't resist. I love that joke. Okay, so an array, as we know, is basically just a list, right? So we have 1, 2, 3. There we go. We have an array, and when we console.log arr, I open this up in the browser. I hit F12. Here we have the array. One quick thing to note. From our last code lesson to this one, I just commented out the modal, and I put the modal code into modal.js. So that's there for you whenever you want that. I figured that it's probably a good idea to keep that in the long run, just so that, you know, if you ever wanted to expand on it or just play with it, or get your hands a little dirty with some raw JavaScript, that's a pretty good place to start. So I just commented that code out, and I kept the CSS the same. So that's why we have this background color, and the font is going to be white. Anyway, moving on. So I console log the array, and I have 1, 2, 3, and the keys, or the indexes, are 0, 1, and 2. Remember, computers start counting at 0. So why is this important? Well, because we didn't formally learn about arrays yet. We know that array, or ARR0, is going to be the first one, because this one is 0, and this one is 1, and this one is 2. We know that because when we console log, the browser tells us exactly what it knows. Okay, great. So when I console log 1, what is that going to show up with? If you said 2, then yeah, you're correct. Now, why are arrays important? Well, because holding lists of information can make programming life a lot easier. And as an example, let's look at a very basic loop, the for loop. So we say for variable I in ARR, and what I usually means, whenever you see I, it means index. And this is just saying for whatever index is inside of array, and it gives us these values. So just like a function, we can use index inside of here. So what happens when we console log index? Well, now we have that 0, 1, and 2, which match with that, actually, with this. 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2. So now we have those. Those are accessible to us. But what if we console log ARR from this for loop? It's just printing out the same thing 3 times. That's useless to us. Where it becomes valuable to us is when we console log ARR and we put index into the array brackets. So now this is going to loop through each one of these, and it's going to ask for ARR 0, ARR 1, ARR 2. So let's go back, refresh. There we go, 1, 2, 3. Now we have these values. So now we can work with this information. I'm just going to go back in here and create another element called test, and variable test is nope, not text. Test is equal to document dot query selector ID test, and test.innerHTML is equal to whatever it currently is, plus, let's add some HTML in there, and then ARR index, just like that. So now what this page is going to think it's doing is it's looping through each one of these, and for each one, it's going to add a new line for whatever the index is. So it's going to start with a new line because this is, well, the very first one. And it's going to say 1, then on a new line, 2, then on a new line, 3. Let's check it out, refresh, just as expected, 1, 2, and 3. So now, what happens if we put an array inside of an array? Well, let's take a look at that. Let's do var array2 is equal to 1. But instead of 2, let's put another array in there. We have 2 point, let's actually do numbers. It's going to look better. 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. And then let's continue with just a regular array value. Now console.log arr2. And now we have our first value is 1, our second value is an array, which has 3 values in it, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and we have our third value, which is just 3. So now if we wanted to get the value of 2.2, all we have to do is look at this and say, okay, well, I know that I have to get ARR1, because that's what this array is, right? ARR2. In fact, let's rename that. Call it new array. So we know it's not going to be 0. We know that this whole section here is 1, and this section here is 2. But in here is also 0, 1, and 2. And I'm just going to comment that out, but keep it in here because it's quite relevant. So if we wanted to get, let's say 2.2, we would say console.log new array. Well, which one are we looking for? Are we looking for 0? No, we want 1. And then next to that one, which one do we want? Do we want 2.1 is 0 is the first one. 2.2, just ignore this part, which is number 1, or 2.3, which is number 2. Well, if we want the middle one, we go with 1. Now, comment that out and show you that it works. We got 2.2, just as expected. Now, you can put as many arrays inside of any amount of arrays as you want. Just know that it gets more and more complicated, and it gets harder for your brain to organize what's going on. And oftentimes, you're going to have loops inside of loops. And if you wanted to print all of these values out, that's exactly what you would do. Because what happens when we go back to our page, we get 1, 2, 3. That's for the wrong array. So let's do new array here, and where we changed it here, we also have to change it here. Save, refresh. And now what the page has done is printed each value on a new line. But because this is an array, JavaScript immediately thinks, oh, you probably want a comma between each one, which is not technically true. Now, how do we know if this is an array or a string or anything like that? What we can do is console log new array index constructor. Save that, go back to our page, and wow, look at that. We have string, array, and a string. So what happens if we only wanted an array inside of an array? We said if new array.constructor is equal to array, remember, this is case sensitive, console.log new array index. Now, this should ideally filter out everything that's not an array inside of this array. So it's going to ignore 1 and 3, and it's only going to show 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. There we have it, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. The other two are unfortunately artifacts of what we're just working on. So to make that clearer, there we go. Now, if you wanted to see if it was a string, well, what we saw before, instead of array, is string. And this will filter out the arrays. Now we only have 1 and 3. Now that's a quick example of how to use an array in a very basic for loop. We're going to talk more about loops exclusively, just because they definitely deserve their own lesson. But the array here is It's very important to know that arrays are lists, and inside of these lists, you can have more lists. So I'm just going to leave this code here so that you can take a look at it, mess around with it, explore it, do whatever you like with it. And in the next lesson, we're going to learn a little bit more about objects, and then we're going to get into loops.